Alright, here it is, the Advanced Guide to Weapons video. I'll be doing a little bit of analysis on the weapons in DC20 and providing a mathematical breakdown on some of the properties in the game. I'm assuming you have a pretty good understanding of how weapons work in DC20. If you aren't totally sure, then go ahead and watch my basic guide to weapons video, which should be on the screen now and in the description. Alright, to start this off, the weapon styles. So, the important thing to realize with the styles is that they're all essentially a way to increase the base damage of your weapon. If you're playing optimally, you should be able to, or at least try to, have most of your attacks trigger the weapon passive. Because of this, I've categorized the weapon styles into two categories, save or condition dependent, and then situational. The first category is pretty intuitive. You get 1 damage when a certain condition is applied, which can oftentimes be done through a save maneuver. So here we're working with bleed, grapple, dazed, impaired, hindered, and exposed. Now, the big question is that these are all the same damage bonus, so which one are you most easily able to inflict and keep up? Well, let's first talk about the conditions that are most likely to be applied and stick around. At the top is probably grappled. If you have an optimized build, it's almost trivial to grapple an enemy and keep them grappled. If you want a breakdown on that, go watch my grappling guide, which should be on the screen now and in the description below. But let's say that you don't want to use a freehand, or don't want to make a might build and invest into grappling. Well, then your next best bet is kind of a split. Personally, I like bleed, mainly because unlike many of the other save maneuvers, which only last until the next check, bleed sticks around until the enemy succeeds on the DC10 medicine check. While that might effectively just be 1 AP for some creatures, if you're fighting creatures with low intelligence, it's much better. This can potentially last you multiple turns without having to reapply it every time. However, I think there is a more consistent option that might be even better than bleed, and that's exposed. See, the exposed maneuver is pretty bad, since it'll only give exposed against the next attack, so you'll only benefit from that passive once. This is the same issue that hindered, dazed, and impaired have, although they aren't on the attack. The difference is that exposed is a little bit unique. See, it's included in a lot of other conditions. You can watch my conditions video to get more details, you know the drill, on the screen or in the description. But in short, the big one here is prone, which lasts a bit longer and can be quite devastating on its own. Now, I will say that hindered is also a part of prone, so you could also use a staff, but exposed also shows up in quite a few more places, and the condition itself increases the chance of you hitting, making the bonus damage even more effective. So I'm giving it a decent bump for that reason. It's worth noting that bows have the ability to benefit from the slowed condition, which doesn't have the issue on its save maneuver of lasting until the next check, and it goes until the end of your next turn. That's at least enough time to use the attack and take advantage of the slowed that you set up until your next turn. It's probably better than some of the other passives here. I'd say probably between exposed and bleed. Alright, so that's the save maneuvers compared. Let's talk about the situational ones. First off is chained. Unfortunately, it's a bit of an underperformer. It can do great in some situations, negating cover and shields while doing extra damage on top of that. That's really good, but unfortunately, it does nothing if your enemies don't use either. And there's not really a lot of consistent ways for you to bring it up. Might be good to have a chained weapon in your back pocket for those moments, but probably not as your default weapon. Then we got crossbow. This is the focused firing style. You get additional damage if you attack the target with that weapon since the start of your last turn. This is very reliable, but you have to keep in mind that since crossbow weapons require you to have reload, each attack also costs 2 AP pretty much. We'll get to reload later. Spear, on the other hand, is a very good style, and the passive can activate very frequently. Now, technically there's a few passives to spear, but we're mainly going to focus on the passive that allows you to get bonus damage when you move 2 spaces towards the target before the attack. There's some really neat interactions here, like Barbarian's Berserker feature, letting you move 2 spaces before an attack to kind of build that in. But these setups can sometimes end up getting opportunity attacks, so you need to be careful when you use them. However, you can always try to use things like the knockback maneuver or shove to get the enemy pushed back so you can charge at them again. If you get clever with movement features, there are quite a few ways to make this passive more reliable. But the strongest weapon passive, or at least one of the strongest, is the whip style. First off, there's an important note. Currently, the whip style doesn't specify that it has to be on melee attacks, which means any thrown weapon you have is almost always better off being a whip weapon because it's always hitting from a distance. But okay, this is pretty obviously an oversight and not the game working as intended, so if you want to be reasonable, just house rule that it only applies to melee attacks. That's certainly what I would do. But let's assume you make that change. Is it still really that strong? Well, normally it's fine. You just try to be good about your positioning, take advantage of the reach property, and get good value off the damage. There's a key difference though between the whip and spear style, and that's that the spear style requires you to keep setting up every single attack. It's hard to repeatedly move 2 spaces towards a target, since eventually you reach the target and you can't move towards them any closer. With the whip style, you just need to be in the right spot once, and then all the attacks will benefit from this passive. This is particularly strong with features like Spellblade's Blink Blade, as you can move 1 space away before attacking without provoking opportunity attacks, and then make as many attacks as you can get away with all that benefit from the passive. If you kind of use this optimally, this is about as close as it gets to permanent damage increase from a style. However, it's worth noting that this passive is basically taxing you to take the reach property, which does limit the weapon a bit. Even with my praise of the whip style, it's important to note that this is all dependent on your class and playstyle. You shouldn't use the whip style on a weapon that doesn't have reach, so each weapon still does have some preference towards the styles. Alright, with all the styles out of the way, let's talk about the properties. Starting off with Concealable. So, this works once per creature, not once per weapon, but to be honest, it might as well be once per weapon, because you have to spend an AP to conceal it again before you can really benefit from it. So really the better solution here is to have a stash of concealable throwing knives or something, which you can use to make these advantage attacks against each creature in a combat. There are some things about this property and the concealing rules don't really clarify, like how many objects can be concealed and if you need to have a specific compartment or something to conceal an object. In a best case scenario, this seems like a great property to have a stash of concealing with thrown weapons, but not for something that you'd use on a main weapon. Let's talk about the opposite of that property, Guard. Now, when I say opposite, I mean that if Concealable is mainly not for main weapons, but for a thing you want to have a stash of and not hold in your main hand, Guard is the opposite of that. You always want to have it in your main hand, and it serves basically no purpose stashed in your bag, or cloak, or wherever your concealed weapons are. Guard is a really great property. It stacks with itself, letting you get multiple instances of that PD bonus at the same time, which can provide great defensive value by letting you have what is basically a better version of a light shield. On top of that, it is one of the main reasons secondary arms is such an issue. You might think it's just plus 4 PD, but what you need to realize is that you can wield 2 heavy shields in your main 2 hands and then 2 guard weapons in those secondary arms. This gives you a total of plus 6 PD, which requires no armor and still lets you dual wield. So hopefully you can see why I think secondary arms is a bit of a problematic trait in the game right now. Without it, Guard would still be very strong, but definitely less so. The other great thing about Guard is that since it's a property and not a style, casters can benefit from it too. Meaning right now, if you're a caster that never really plans to be swinging your weapon at all, and you can't use a shield, you may as well hold on to a guard weapon in at least one of your 2 free hands, as if it was a light shield. Of course, remember that you likely need at least 1 free hand to cast spells that use somatic components. Alright, moving on to another staple, we have Impact. So this is basically your light core damage increasing feature. It's a damage buff, but doesn't cost 2 points. It's pretty much a go-to feature on any weapon that's supposed to do big damage. Impact typically gives a damage increase of around 0.4 damage per attack on average. Let me clarify what I mean when I talk about damage numbers in this video, because I think it's important to let you all know what I mean. When I talk about the damage increase, I mean if I attacked 100 or 1,000 times with the weapon and took the average of the damage I did with and without impact, what would the difference be? And yes, I am counting things like missing, being 0 damage, and heavy and brutal hits, even crits. Now, I'm not really simulating. I'm doing the calculations on that using my calculator, which any of you can use using the video that should be on the screen now and in the description that's showing off how to use my calculator. I'm going to use screenshots and graphs from that calculator in this video to prove some points about how good a feature might be, or a property. When I use specific numbers like the 0.4 damage increase I used for impact just now, I'm using the baseline assumption that pretty much most of the game is bounced around, which is a player with plus 4 attack check attacking an enemy with 12 PD using a 1 base damage weapon. Now, we kind of assume sometimes that players might be using a 2 base damage weapon, but for this video, I'm talking about a 1 base damage weapon because that's what those default weapons are made as. You can add extra damage using properties like heavy, which we'll talk about later. The graphs in the tables will typically show some of the numbers slightly outside of that PD range. So look at the screen if you want an idea of how it varies, and if you really want to get into the weeds, check out the calculator I mentioned before. Okay, so let's check out this graph. Here you can see how the impact weapon, which is the light blue line, compares to a regular weapon, which is the red line. You can see the impact is a decent damage increase, especially at lower PD values. If I show you the table, you can see that the baseline damage for a regular weapon is 1.3 damage, which goes up to 1.7 using impact. And that's where I got that 0.4 number before. It's the difference in the damage between these two. Alright, let's take a break from the math and talk about multifaceted. So I'm personally not a huge fan of this property. It costs you that property point that you could have been using on something else like guard or impact, and you don't really get much for it. The main appeal is being able to use another benefit style on each attack, but you don't get to have both of them on a single attack. But if you really want to benefit from another style, you're probably better off just switching weapons and having each of those weapons being a little bit stronger. Now, with that being said, there is an argument for it in situations like a magic item, where switching the weapon has you losing out on some other benefits, and you can choose to switch which passive to use even as part of a reaction, like an opportunity attack or a commander's call. Then again, I think as a team, players are better off focusing on a few conditions to capitalize on for more people to benefit from actions that inflict those conditions. Next up is an iconic property, Reach. This is a really strong property for utility because it increases your range. I already talked about that this can enable really strong use of the whip style for consistent damage bonuses. It's also really nice to reduce the amount of movement needed since you can hit from a distance. Now, importantly, none of the range extending features in the game extend your opportunity attack range, including reach. So that does mean you should be mindful when designing the weapon. For example, Unwieldy is often seen as an easy negative to take with reach. So you always can attack from 2 spaces away, and that negative is pretty much inconsequential. However, you won't ever be able to make opportunity attacks from a distance, so you will still suffer the Unwieldy penalty on any of the opportunity attacks you make. Alright, let's talk about another iconic property, Toss. Okay, really Thrown is the iconic one, but let's start with Toss because that makes more sense. It's the most basic way to make a ranged attack with a melee weapon. Technically, all melee weapons can be thrown at a normal range of 1 and a long range of 5, but this basically means you'll always have disadvantage, so realistically it's not something you build around. The thing to mention about Toss is that it's a 5-space normal range, which is the same as the average movement speed of a character, so many times you'll be able to walk up to hit the target, or that target can walk up to hit you right after. Then again, there are many times you might not want to use that AP to move, so you can sort of think of Toss as saving you one move action. Then we can upgrade it to Thrown. The natural upgrade if you're going to make this type of weapon. The range is pretty solid. 10 spaces will cover most of the battlefield a lot of the times. And it's always good to have some backup thrown weapons just in case you get into a fight where you need a ranged option. Although you could just use a ranged weapon, one of the main advantages of thrown weapons is getting to use melee weapon styles on them. A ranged weapon can't possibly get bonus damage against a bleeding target, but a thrown weapon can. Keep in mind that both the thrown and toss properties can be combined with things like two-handed or versatile. I think many people get stuck into thinking that thrown weapons require a single hand, but really they don't. Now the property I've been dreading to talk about, Silent. I honestly can't really tell you what this property does. Normally making an attack ends the hidden condition, and I'm not sure if this negates that because all it does is keep you unheard. But I think you could easily argue that attacking from hidden makes you seen, and that's why you're no longer hidden. To be completely honest, the stealth rules in DC20 are still very unclear, and I'm expecting them to be clarified and potentially reworked at some point in the future. For now though, the weird way that they work is the main reason I haven't made a video on them yet. I'm not even sure how stealth and hiding works in DC20, at least not completely. So I'm going to say that a lot of the strength of this weapon property comes down to how your GM rules the hiding rules. If they say that this lets you stay hidden while attacking, it basically comes out to be permanent advantage on the property, which is incredibly strong. but a GM could pretty much argue that this does nothing, and if they saw you abuse the property after ruling that it keeps you hidden, they may just end up ruling it that way. So yeah, I can't really tell you how good this property is. Alright, back to some math, let's talk about versatile. This is another property you should basically consider to be a damage increase. Now, it doesn't work with dual wielding because you need to use the second hand when you're swinging a versatile weapon, but it does have an amazing synergy with any effect that wants you to have a heavy or brutal hits. Things like bypassing damage resistance, so stuff like PDR, getting barbarian stamina to activate, or impact. In fact, by default this property is around 0.3 damage, but let's look at this in detail. So, here I'm comparing the regular in red, versatile in blue, and a versatile impact weapon in green. Now, visually it's pretty clear to see that versatile is just a damage increase, but pairing it with impact makes it even more impressive. You might be saying, sure, that's because impact also gives more damage, but it's even better than that. See, the versatile alone is a 0.3 damage increase, and the impact alone was a 0.4 damage increase, but the two of them combined provide a 0.8 damage increase. So putting the two of them together gives you a larger damage increase than just adding up their individual increases. To put it more poetically, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, let's set up for some more math and go over to two-handed real quick. I think this one's pretty intuitive to people. Needing two hands means sacrificing the ability for dual wielding, and as far as negative properties go, this is pretty solid, since it's the other option for melee weapons that isn't unwieldy, and that's not always something you can take. So you might choose to take two-handed to get more properties on your weapon, but really most people take two-handed to set up for the heavy trait, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Heavy. It's the largest damage increase property in the game, at least for melee weapons. We'll talk about reload for ranged later. However, it does require two-handed, so it's pretty limiting in its flexibility and usage. On average, it'll come out to a 0.65 damage increase. Looking at the graph, we have the regular in red, and heavy in blue, and heavy impact in green. You can see it's a solid increase in the damage, and adding an impact can boost that even further. Unlike versatile though, this doesn't make the impact any stronger. The benefit of adding both of them is 1.05, which is simply the sum of 0.65 from heavy and the 0.4 from impact. Nonetheless, it can give you some pretty good hits. So, I want to show off a little bit of the math comparing heavy and versatile. On the left, I'm comparing them without impact, and on the right, I'm comparing them with impact. So let's start by looking at them without impact. Well, you can see that heavy is a pretty decent improvement over versatile, with versatile being roughly midway between a regular weapon and a heavy weapon in terms of power. But the gap does close over time. In fact, if a level 1 character was to try to attack an enemy with 23 PD or above, then versatile would actually have a greater damage output, or be roughly the same. But that's not very realistic PD value, so we can more or less ignore that for now. Let's look at the impact comparison then. Here I'm comparing both of them to a regular weapon that has impact, so we can see how much they improve off of the impact weapon. Again, heavy is better, but versatile isn't that far behind. In this situation, it would take an enemy with about 19 PD for the versatile weapon to start winning out in damage. Again, that's still a pretty unreasonable PD value, but it does show that when you factor in impact, versatile starts to catch up to heavy. So overall, heavy is better for just straight damage than versatile. But that's fine, because versatile isn't totally worse off. For one, it still gets all those benefits I mentioned around having a higher heavy hit chance. So if you have many features that benefit from heavy hits, then versatile is great for that. But most importantly, it does what the name says. You don't have to wield it with two hands to attack every time. If you want to use this weapon while you grapple or hold a shield, you can. It is versatile. You gotta love it when the name of a property or a feature is reflected in its mechanics. Now we can get on to the other negative property, which is unwieldy. It's a great negative for toss or thrown weapons, almost a necessary choice for them if you only use them at range, or on some reach weapons. If you have a consistent way to get distance like Blinkblade, it's especially useful. In most situations though, this really isn't worth taking. Spending an AP or having to either use the extend maneuver or give yourself advantage just to get around the penalty of unwieldy really isn't worth the cost most of the time. Now we can get into the special properties, like returning. To be honest, I have no clue why they're called special properties. They work just like every other property in the game. But anyways, returning, it is a bit of a trap in my opinion. It sounds really cool, but the fact is that it only comes back on a miss, meaning you're sort of punished for success. Of course, the fantasy is really cool, but if you want that fantasy of a returning weapon, I highly recommend just going for Warlock's Packed Weapon feature or the Spellblade's Bound Weapon feature, both of which can allow you to return a weapon to your hand after you throw it, or have it leave your hands in any other way. Overall, don't take returning, just focus more on other more useful weapon properties. Alright, time to do it. Let's talk about capture. If you watch my first video, you'll know I don't like capture, and I made a homebrewed version that fixes most of the major issues I have with it. It's an incredibly strong property, and most of it comes down to the fact that it replaces your attack check while benefiting from many of the things that would normally buff your attack check too. So things like versatile or flanking both help. On top of that, it's a skill check, so you can have things like expertise, and if you choose to use athletics for it, since it's a martial check, it could even get permanent advantage from rage. So all of that factored in, you could be using a plus 11 to hit against a physical save at level 1. That's a little bit absurd. But I have a contested roll calculator, which I should have linked in the description, which you can use to calculate the chances of a success. And it'll even show you the chances of a success by 10, or really each by 5. So, by using that calculator, we should see that the range to get restrained is going to be about 30% to 50%, assuming they have a plus 3 to their physical save, which is quite good. Then let's just say that you're always going to have versatile on the weapon, well then that minimum chance goes up to about a 40% chance. And keep in mind, this is also the brutal chance. So despite the fact that the weapon's base damage is reduced by 1, capture weapons easily tend to make up for that through the abnormally high heavy hit and brutal hit chance they have. You can see to the left here, I've got the average damage. If it's a versatile capture weapon without impact, it's around a 1.47 average damage. That's stronger than a regular weapon, which has the average damage of 1.3, but this also has a 40% chance to apply restrained, which is much better than your average weapon. But if we add impact, the average damage goes up to 2.11. For comparison, this is pretty much on par with a heavy weapon without impact, and that's just the damage of it. There's still a huge chance the weapon grapples, and a very good chance it restrains. So hopefully this breakdown explains to you why I think capture is such an obscenely powerful weapon property. Because remember, it costs 0. Any weapon can just have capture added onto it. So I would highly recommend, for the health of your games, to use my capture homebrew, because it brings this back to a reasonable property while keeping the same basic playstyle. Okay, rant over. Let's move on to the ranged weapon properties, starting with long ranged. I think it's pretty intuitive when you take this and why. If you really want that sniper feel, then this does that. I will say though that 15 spaces should already be enough in a lot of fights, so bringing that up to 30 spaces sort of seals the deal and might even be a bit overkill. If your fights happen to be on maps where your enemies are more than 30 spaces away from you, then this weapon will really shine, considering a character with 5 speed can only move 20 spaces in a turn. You can typically get a whole turn worth of attacks before the enemies can even get close to you. This might even be one of those good weapons to have in your back pocket just when you need it, especially if your character is a ranged specialist. Finally, we got the reload property. Now this is quite an interesting property. First off, it allows for the highest base damage weapon in the game when combined with a heavy property, reaching a total of 3 base damage. But the tricky part is that you have to reload it each time when you make an attack, or before you make an attack. So it's sort of similar to saying that the attack costs 2 AP. Even though technically it doesn't, you can spend that second AP to reload whenever you want, but you have to spend it eventually if you want to attack with that weapon again. So, what I want to do is compare reload to making 2 attacks, one with regular and one with disadvantage. I'm choosing that instead of just attacking with advantage because it leads to better average damage than attacking with advantage, but both are 2 AP worth of attacking. So, really what I'm looking at here is how much damage did the reload add to my attack, and how much did the second attack, the one with advantage, add to the sort of overall attack. In the case where I have a 1 base damage weapon, adding reload would add 0.65 damage. The same amount heavy would, since mathematically they're doing the same thing, adding 1 base damage. Meanwhile, the second attack would add 0.61 damage. So we can see that reload is a little bit better in this case, although the margin is pretty small. However, let's say I'm starting with a heavy weapon, and choosing to either make it 3 damage with the reload property or attack twice with it, the second time being a disadvantage. Well, reload is still just adding 0.65 damage, but the second attack is now adding about 1.03 damage. So with a higher base damage, you're better off just attacking more than using reload to increase the base damage. Now, there is an important caveat to this. I don't really have to reload to make that first attack. I just need to reload if I want to attack again with that weapon. So what you could do is just have a stash of heavy reload crossbows that are already loaded in your backpack, and you pull them out when you need to make the attack. Although, to be honest, I find this tactic rather stupid, and I think a GM should punish you for walking around with a backpack full of loaded crossbows. It would be stupid to do in real life, and I don't see why it shouldn't be stupid to do here. But currently, there are no rules in the game against it, so it's up to the GM to decide how to deal with it. Alright, that wraps up all the weapon properties. For all the melee properties that are available to ranged weapons, the basic math and logic is the same. The big takeaway here is that you want to make your weapon based on your playstyles. Whip and spear can be great styles to build around, just as grapple, axe, and sword can be. As far as properties go, guard, impact, heavy, and versatile are all pretty staple properties. You're going to see a lot of people use those on damage-dealing weapons, although there is some great stuff to be said about things like reach and thrown when you build around them. Overall, though, I really just recommend building the weapon that matches the playstyle you want for your character. As you can see, the variance in damage is pretty low, between the weakest and strongest properties. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is to have fun and really enjoy playing the character that you made. But if you're the kind of person that enjoys big damage numbers, and especially consistent big damage numbers, this video should have done a pretty good job educating you on the choices you might want to make. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until the next time, have the best time.